Welcome to the Chapter 5 review video on the development of apartheid by Haley Winder and Sabella Gaudioso.
Question 1. The Department of Native Affairs. How important was the Department of Native Affairs in implementing apartheid? After the National Party gained control in May of 1948, race relations was top priority within the government of South Africa. In fact, much of their decisions were dependent upon this prism of race. Their reliance on race contributed to their bureaucracy and social services, which were mainly concerned about the implementation of apartheid and fighting any and all opposition to such rules. At the center of their bureaucracy, the Department of Native Affairs, otherwise known as the Native Affairs Department, handled all executions of these racial policies. So before 1950, they stayed out of the public's eye, and even when the National Party first came to power, the original head minister, E.G. Jansen, was not in tune to the values of apartheid. Instead, he suggested to give property-owning rights to blacks as a way to gain their trust and have them comply to the policies of apartheid. Eventually, Hendrik Verwoerd became his successor. The difference in character was undeniable. Hendrik was what one would call an ideologue, who was completely and solely committed to apartheid. With Hendrik as Minister of the Department of Native Affairs, and his core value being implementing apartheid, his reasoning was that apartheid was an essential part of their society, as they needed to protect Africans from Western influence and ensure they were not trying to assimilate into Western culture, but instead develop into their own. With this seemingly sympathetic argument, they were able to normalize apartheid to the point of Africans accepting it. And when the work of the bureaucracy expanded, as the deployment opportunities within the government, which is why apartheid was maintained rather well, because these employees depended on its survival. Within the department, their main responsibilities consisted of a few things. Number 1, their labor bureau. They were in charge of allocating African workers to specific jobs in specific locations, thus controlling their mobility. Number 2, the department made it their concern to address the shortage of 170,000 housing units for Africans. This shortage came about because of forced removals, and their solution was to create cheaply made and mass-produced housing, which became effective and actually lessened the African opposition to apartheid. The department's solution became known as locations or townships, which were often on the edge of urban centers. And number 3, their control of homelands, reserved for Africans or particular tribes, often known as Bantustans. This was just another way that the department ensured apartheid, since at the end of the day, any decision was their decision.
Implementation of apartheid. How far did apartheid legislation affect lives? During the apartheid era in South Africa, the government's intention was to keep the different races as far apart as possible and keep Africans separated in distinct tribal units. The apartheid legislation in the 1950s impacted millions of South African lives to a great extent due to the negative changes it brought upon Black Africans socially, economically, and politically. First, the legislation affected their lives socially with the Group Areas Act of 1950. It required registration of all land ownership, gave the government authority to control what racial groups occupied certain areas, led to the forced eviction of groups, typically blacks, and the forced eviction of 3.5 million Africans from 1960 to 1983. The Prohibition of Mixed Marriage Act of 1949 and Immorality Act of 1950 declared that marriage and/or sexual relations between people of different racial groups was illegal and forced married couples to separate. The Population Registration Act of 1950 deems that different racial groups need to be kept separate, and interracial marriages were forced to separate. And children who were lighter or darker than their parents could not stay with them, and families were torn apart. Essentially, each of these acts brought about a form of segregation. South Africans were impacted because people of different races were not allowed to mix, which ultimately constrained the social mobility of Africans. Now for the negative economical impact. The Bantu Authorities Act of 1951 reiterated that all Africans could only live in tribal reserves. Tribal leaders were in charge of these tribal reserves, and they were in charge of the allocation of land, developmental programs, and welfare policies. The negative economic impact is that the homelands, however, could not support more than 2/3 of the population of Africans. This act allowed for the government to play a blind eye and ignore the pleas of tribal leaders and not assist them in supplying more land or industrial developments. Because of this, the homelands never became self-sufficient. The Native Labor Act of 1953 said that blacks are not permitted to belong to trade unions or participate in labor strikes. This led to stay away, where Africans stayed home from work as a protest to circumvent the ban on strikes. Because of this act, Africans were not able to attain changes or fight for their own rights in the workplace, meaning that they had to remain in bad working environments, keep their low wages, etc. The Extension of Universities Act of 1959 prevented Africans from attending English-speaking universities. In all of South Africa, there was only 3 strictly segregated universities in which Africans could attend. Typically, those with a higher education achieve higher economic statuses by securing good jobs. Because of such restrictions that this act brought about, it prevented many Africans from attending university and in the long run affected their future economic success. And on to the negative political impact. The Separate Representation of Voters Act of 1951 initially caused a constitutional crisis between the national and united parties. The government believed that only whites should have a say in elections. As blacks were essentially disenfranchised by 1956, they weren't able to vote and therefore had no say in elections and couldn't vote for their own candidates and representatives in government. The Native Laws Amendment Act of 1952 required Africans to carry passbooks in order to travel from province to province. As this act restrained the mobility of many Africans to get from area to area, it also stunted the political activity of many, as they couldn't go out to vote. The Bantu Education Act of 1953 gave the state control over African education. Therefore, the educational system began to fall apart, and eventually less than 33% of African children attended school at all. Lack of education led to Bantu not understanding the dynamics and workings of the political system, and this ignorance therefore led many not to vote, as they didn't know how to do so correctly and weren't aware of the current political happenings.
Question 3. Key debate. How far was the National Party electoral victory in 1948 a turning point in South Africa's history? After the National Party electoral victory in 1948, many believe it was a significant development in South Africa's racial history, especially with their racial policies under apartheid during the 1950s and the 60s. However, one concern many historians still have is how far the National Party actually contributed to this change. One historian in particular, Ivan Evans, suggests that although the National Party made advances towards Grand Apartheid, their policies only built upon existing principles. And even with Grand Apartheid, it was never a set-in-stone goal, just a series of actions that exemplified an already present apartheid system. And journalist Alistair Sparks seems to agree as well. In fact, in 2014, Saul Jabot maintains the shared view by acknowledging the party did not have a clear plan set in place, and it was an unexpected victory on their part to reach this Grand Apartheid. Additionally, Beinart agrees there was no blueprint for apartheid. However, the National Party was more prepared to stretch the Constitution and achieve their objectives. Not to mention their racism was more entrenched. As a whole, though, many historians can agree that rapid or slow, the National Party's movements towards developing apartheid policies would result eventually in the emergence of Grand Apartheid.
On to question number 4, opposition and repression. How effective was the opposition to apartheid during the 1950s? During the 1950s, legislation was being passed to suppress dissent. As the government grew more extreme, so did the opposition to it. The developments from opposition groups such as boycotts, mass action, and growing militancy throughout the 50s were effective only to a limited extent. First, there were boycotts. Opposition groups organized so many boycotts during the 50s, each with varying degrees of success. The Women's Pass protest of 1956 was organized by the Federation of South African Women. These were protest movements against women having to register for passes and carry passbooks. Women's Day on August 9, 1956, was where 20,000 people marched with a petition signed by 100,000. Protests continued and the government responded with violence. However, by 1960, 75% of women had been issued passes. Then there was the Alexandria bus boycott. It was a successful boycott against the Putco bus service when they raised fares. Thousands walked in protest, and it was one of the most successful protests of the 1950s, as the government agreed to subsidize the company. The potato boycott of 1957 to 1959 was by the ANC. They agreed to it when the Ministry of Justice had been using unemployed Africans and criminals as laborers. They weren't paid, only given basic shelter and food, and were locked up at night. Some were forced to dig potatoes with their hands. People started to boycott by refusing to buy potatoes, and as a result, potatoes rotted. Farmers agreed to improve conditions for workers, which made it a success. In conclusion, some boycotts were successful, but only to a limited extent. They did not address the long-term goals of overthrowing apartheid. They tended to be localized and short-term, and the government eventually learned to respond to every major protest with new repressive laws. Then there was mass action and cooperation between ethnic groups. The Durban riots were an example of this. So where Africans accused Indian shopkeepers of exploiting them by charging high food prices. 58 stores were damaged in the process, and some argued the real cause was Indians just happened to be in proximity to the bad African conditions. Authorities did little to prevent or stop the riots, and 142 died. The fact that there was internal conflict between Indians and Africans demonstrate the ineffectiveness in their opposition to the main enemy at hand, which was apartheid, as they could not cooperate together.
Question 5. Rural unrest. How extensive was rural unrest? Despite the ANC having support in urban areas, their rural areas experienced numerous cases of unrest, especially during the 1950s. With this tension, it often concerned white government officials that were often attempting to dictate matters, despite tribal officials having control. And since opposition to the government in rural areas was sporadic, this made it more difficult to both anticipate and suppress these uprisings. One instance in particular was the Z-Rust uprising of 1957. When the tribe leader was forced to make women accept their passes, he refused. Unfortunately, he was then dismissed, and the women in turn boycotted the shops of white owners who were handing them out. Additionally, other men and women in the area joined in on the protests and burned their passes, while boycotting schools as well. This is where passes were accepted. Eventually, though, women were forced to accept the use of passes. However, this event remains significant because it exemplifies what a lot of the issues were in rural areas, mainly the power of local chieftains. On the other hand, in East Pondoland, when the chief sided with the authorities in regard to land disputes, violent clashes took place between residents and police. Boycotts were a prominent form of protest, and many boycotted white-owned businesses. Despite their efforts, though, the rebellion was suppressed and the boycotts ended soon after. Much of their rural opposition was because of the government's invasive nature, which consisted of them attending all official tribe meetings so they could determine if the chieftains were local agents of the government rather than representatives of the people.